Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming in this sunny day. We're delighted to welcome you to the 4th edition of the Agrisultainability Talks. Before we kick off, a few housekeeping rules. On your badges, you will find a QR code. Please scan it to access the program. You will also find a short bio of the speakers and moderators and today's lunch menu. Today, we have 2 panel sessions, each with 5 to 6 speakers plus a moderator. Each speaker will make a brief presentation. Following that, the moderator will open the floor for questions and answers. We want as many questions as possible. Feel free to ask as many questions as you wish. Please wait for the microphone to be handed to you. The reason is that we are recording the talks. After panel 1, we will have a 15-minute break. I hope you enjoyed the Brazilian pão de queijo and coffee or tea. The second panel will start sharp on time, so I kindly ask you to please return to your seats on time. Without further ado, let's listen to the opening remarks by Ambassador Fred Arruda, which will be followed by the keynote speech by Ricardo Santin, the president of the Brazilian Animal Protein Association. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugo. Good morning and welcome to the 4th edition of our annual seminar, Agri-Sustainability Talks. Many of you will remember that the last edition, initially scheduled for December 2021, had to be delayed to early February this year due to COVID-related travel restrictions. So it's been only 9 months since we last gathered here to discuss sustainable agriculture. And yet, so much has changed. See? A conflict in the heart of Europe has aggravated disruptions in international trade. Inflation has followed, not least in developed economies such as the UK. The world has plunged into an energy crisis and a food crisis. In short, we have been reminded that energy and food supplies cannot be taken for granted. And all of these against the backdrop of global warming, making the need for sustainable production and supply chains even more pressing. In this edition of Agri-Sustainability Talks, we want to make a strong case that trade, energy, and food security and sustainability are intrinsically interconnected. Our first panel, Securing Sustainable Links in the Food Supply Chains, will bring together leading food industry representatives and policymakers. They will share their perspectives on best practices to provide food security while ensuring sustainable supply chains. We value different views and look forward to a constructive debate. We also want to show that tropical rainforest and tropical agriculture are not incompatible, as some tend to believe. Quite the contrary, agriculture is part of the solution to the challenge of nature conservation. Brazil is a case in point. We have managed to preserve 66% of our native vegetation, not by accident, but as a result of hard work, including in the building of an innovative, driven agriculture. In the panel, Why Good Projects Matter, Case Studies, Initiatives, and Opportunities, we are going to hear firsthand from specialists working in the field what the best instruments available to support forest conservation are. We are going to hear about flagship projects and find out how Brazil and the UK can work closer together towards this common goal. Before I conclude, please allow me to thank everyone for your participation. Thank you to our speakers, some of whom have came a long way from Brazil, all of whom have made space in their busy schedules to bring us their contribution. Thank you to our moderators for their readiness to help us put together a meaningful and dynamic event. Thank you to each one in the audience. I encourage you to actively take part in today's conversation. I hope you all enjoyed the seminar, as well as the Brazilian food and drinks that will follow. Thank you. So, Ricardo, may I invite you here?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I would like to greet Ambassador Fred Arruda, the Brazilian embassy team, Hugo, Leticia, and all the people that works here, the Apex Brazil, that support this event as well. It's an honor to me to be here, and thanks for all the audience, the press, and the people that are here. I'm Ricardo Santini. I would like to show you some figures about the Brazil production. Please, when I change. Oh, yes, this is a good thing. And so I work for Brazilian Protein Association. Actually, we handle with the proteins of chicken, pork, and egg in Brazil. Also genetic material, duck, turkey, and we're not handled with beef, but we are animal protein, and we have more than 130 associated members from companies from all the chain, the producers, the industries, and we handle with the 5 international brands. It's Brazilian chicken, Brazilian pork, Brazilian egg, Brazilian duck, and also Brazilian breeders. Brazil is becoming a large exporter of genetic material of chicken meat. And which are the characteristics of this kind of production? Brazil has a lot of natural resources, as Ambassador said before. We have a grain availability. We have an integrated system of production that gives us a total traceability of the process of production. We have a sanitary status very, very good. We never ever have any case of avian influenza. Flexibility and variety of the markets, and also investments in high technology to produce a food, a security food, a biosafety food. But when you look to the ESG of our production, we gave to the small cities that we are located with the production of chicken, meat, and pork and egg, a very good index of development. And when you look at the red points in this map, is the place where you have the production of chicken meat, and the people, these cities are the best rated in the development index in Brazil. And so we have a very, very important social role in Brazil, especially in small families. We have more than 100,000 small families producing chicken, eggs, and pork in Brazil. And the average of these properties are less than 10 acres per family. But why do we do this? We do with increasing our production, investing in technology. This is a chart that probably my colleague Rodrigo will speak after in the panel, but we increased more than 400% of our production of grains and increased only 60% of use of land. In Brazil, you know, Ambassador said, we preserve 66.3% of our native forests. But we use less than 30% of our land in Brazil to produce food. When you compare with the United States uses more than 70% of the land. And here in Europe, more than 60%. And Brazil uses less than 30% and protect more than 66% of native forests, not reforests. But when you look to the Amazon biome, we reforested in the last 20 years more than 23 million acres of forests. It means like the territory of Portugal. Brazil has the Alliance of Forests doing the same. We take care about this. But we take care also in our industry, especially to prevent the diseases of the animal. We take care about the welfare of the animals, but also the wealth of the people that work on it. We have more than 500,000 people working directly on the plants, producing food, but more than 4 million persons in this chain. But when you look to the animals, we take care about the animal welfare and also the biosecurity of these animals. Brazil is the only larger producer of chicken in the world that never ever have any case of avian influenza. Unfortunately, here you have this chart is from OMSA, the former OIE, as we called before, but Animal Health Organization. But when you look here, we have United States, unfortunately European Union as well, Japan, and some countries in Asia, with outbreaks of avian influenza, and everyone knows we are just starting the winter in this North Hemisphere. And Brazil used to prevent this, and I hope so. I pray, I knock the wood, but we work a lot on prevention. And this is why we take care. The flyways go over Brazil, and we never have a case of this. And this is what Brazil is trying to work in complementation of the local productions. And this is an example. When you look to the chicken meat production, in Japan, for instance, we have, I need to look at 16% of the market share. When you look to China, our exports are only less than 4%. But when you look to Qatar, everyone is looking the World Cup, Soccer World Cup. We have 67% of market share. Nowadays, probably 75%. The people that were in Qatar today will eat, in each 10 chickens that they will be eaten in Qatar, 7 probably came from Brazil. This is what we do in the world and more than 150 countries. We complement the local production. And it's not different here in the European Union, the neighbor from UK. As in the past, UK integrated this European Union. Look to the European Union. Brazil represents less than 2% of the total production of the European Union. So we don't jeopardize the local production. I'm sorry, the people that say, you are jeopardizing the local production. It's less than 2% of the production. Of course, when you look, but you export only breast meat. And when you look to the breast meat, it's more than 20% probably. But we are complementing the local production. And why we are complementing? Because if you would need to produce this volume of chicken meat that is imported from Brazil locally, you will produce together with the breast meat, a wing, a thigh, a whole chicken. And what will you do with the rest of the chicken? It's easy. We can export. Yeah, it's easy to say. We eat the breast here in the European Union and export the rest of the chicken. But if I export to abroad, I need to compete with Brazil, Thailand, United States, that has a lower cost of production due to the natural conditions that we have. And so this is the complementation process that I'm talking about. We're not jeopardizing, but if you have the local industry with a big availability of products of thighs, wings in the local market, this will put the price down of the local production. And this is what we are saying. We want only to keep this complementation process. And when you look to the figures, we sent to European Union in the last 22 years more than 7.2 million tons of chicken meat. The majority of this is breast meat, but some other products as well. It means more than 288,000 containers. And people eat, no one gets sick. no one get with problems. We just, and why I'm showing these figures? Because sometimes I see people say, Brazil don't have welfare, Brazil don't complain with the standards of United States, of European Union. And I ask, and what happened with these 7.2 million tons of chicken meat that were eaten in European Union in the last 20 years? We are really doing this? Or this is a protectionist speech? This is what you are saying. We are just selling and complementing the local industry and giving conditions for people that eat our products to get a safe product, a very high quality product in a very affordable place. And just there is another point on this complementation, and I'll show you the figures for United Kingdom exports from Brazil. In the last 20 years, we exported more than 1.5 million tons, more than 59,000 containers. But we do not export direct to the shelves of the supermarket. We do export for the local processing plants that create jobs here, that create and pay taxes here. It's a win-win partnership. We provide a raw material, the local processors use this raw material to process here, and we give to the consumers a very affordable price. And this is what Brazil do in the world. And why you do this? Because we have the conditions to split the chicken for the different regions of the planet. Brazil is the largest exporter of chicken meat in the world, with more than 37% of market share of the global market share of the exports. And we export, for instance, the cartilage and the kakugiri to Japan, to the chicken breast to Mexico and to European Union and to UK, and to the shawarma and griller to the Middle East. But we do this with one main value, the sustainability. Sustainability is in our way to live, in our way to produce, in our DNA. How you do this? This is the chart that Ambassador talked before, and I talked before. Brazil preserves 66.3% of our territory of native forests. Only in Amazon biome, we preserve it more than 4 million square kilometers preserved. And we do this, and we will still do this, because we believe that we need to take care of our environment. And sustainability means no hungry people. When you take care about the sustainability, we are looking forward to provide food to the people in a sustainable way. And when we look this, we export animal protein to Africa, to Asia, to America, to European Union. All the world receive this protein. Because doing this, we keep the local and respect the consumption habits and religions, cultures. Because we need to produce and to respect the local customs of this and the local habits of these people. And to produce in sustainable way, and I would like to show you this figure in this chart. This is a production in Brazil. This is what you do. We have a native forest in the neighborhood of this production, and you plant exotic forest. It's a eucalyptus forest that has no fruits to prevent the birds to go there and to bring the avian influenza to the production. This is what you do. This is a biosecurity measure. But when you do this, we plant new trees. When you look to the Brazil, we need to respect a riparian forests much higher than, in some cases, 200 meters. When I arrived here by plane, I looked at the riparian forests are maybe 10 meters. This is why we use only less than 30% of our land to do this. And today we'll have a representative of DEFRA, and I would like to show you these figures when you talk about sustainability in Brazil and the chicken meat production. These figures are a work made by DEFRA and GRC. It's a 2008 research. And this comparison shows that Brazil chicken meat has a carbon footprint of 1.2 carbon equivalent. Local production in UK is 2.2. When you added the transport from Brazil to the shelves of supermarkets, the Brazilian production reached the shelves with 2.757 and the local 2.82. And I'm not saying that the local is not good. They are doing their best. But Brazil has natural conditions that allow us don't use energy, because you don't have this winter as you have here, to produce chicken. And this research that were made in 2008 is not updated. And probably Brazil is more sustainable today than were in 2008, because we improve our practices. We have biodigesters in pork production. We have a solar energy. ABPA has a program to incentivize sustainable production of chicken, and pushing the Brazilian producers to have the solar energy in their production. And you have the ABC project from Brazil of government. And these kind of things make the Brazil more sustainable than it were in the past. And this is why I'm told you that Brazil is contributing with the food security in the world, in some cases of only 2%, in some cases with 80%, and this is what we are advocated to do. We are looking to help the people to have affordable protein source. Because here, today, we have probably more than 1 billion persons in hunger in the world. And you need to look at this. Of course, we need to have a very high standards, and I am Vice President of International Poultry Council. And all I said in our meetings that Brazil, European Union, United States, Thailand, we can afford any kind of standards that we can create. But maybe the small countries, the undeveloped countries, cannot do it. And we need to take care about these people that are in hunger in the world. The COVID shows us what is more important in the world, the food. And this is what you are saying here, that we want to complement the local production. This is my statement and my final chart. I would like to say that the world should have no border for food. There is no space more for protectionism. We have more than 1 billion persons in hunger in the world, and we reach these times 8 billion persons in the world. In 2037, probably will be 9 billion persons. Brazil is doing his part. We are producing with security, with safety, taking care of the people, taking care of the animals. We have these companies, Mr. Mauricio will be in the panel today and show that we are not doing greenwashing. We are saying we have companies that has a commitment to be net zero in 2040. This is what Brazil is doing, trying to produce in an affordable way, in a respectful way, respecting the animals that we honor to become food for us, respecting the people that work, having a very strong legislation, but saying to the world, we are ready to collaborate, to cooperate, and to complement the local production to assure the food security. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the time.
Okay, thank you very much for your opening remarks, Ambassador, and for the thought-provoking keynote speech, Mr. Santin. Now we are ready to start panel 1, Securing Sustainable Links in the Food Supply Chains. I would like to invite the speakers and the moderator of the panel to take their seats. Mr. Ian Wright, the Vice Chair of Hume Brophy Communications and columnist for the magazine The Grocer, will be moderating this session. He has a long track record in the food industry. I'll leave the introduction of the members of the panel to Mr. Wright. Onto the stage, please.
Thank you, Hugo. Can I ask my fellow panelists to come up? You can sit where you like, more or less, as long as you leave me the one in the middle. Where are Anna? You come there. Yeah. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us here in Brazil. An important point, I think, to remember that we are, in fact, in Brazil. And we're delighted to be here. Clearly, the Argentinian contingent are outside trying to disturb us, and I apologize for that. And if it's either that or somebody with really bad indigestion. So I hope that we won't hear too much of that, but I'm sure with the microphones that we have, you will hear from everybody. I'm not going to do the introductions directly now. I'm going to let each of the speakers introduce themselves. They each have a presentation. As Hugo just said, we have a presentation of somewhere around 10 minutes to do in each case. And then I have a couple of questions to direct to each of them, and then we'll see how the time goes. But please be ready with your questions. I may cut my scripted questions short in order to get as many questions as possible to you. Now, the ambassador just talked to us about some of the challenges to the sustainability of the food supply chain that we've seen over the last few months and maybe over the last couple of years. Clearly, COVID has been a massive challenge. Ukraine, Russia is a significant disruption to the global food chain, particularly in grain and fertilizer. And some of the impacts of that conflict have already been seen, but most of them are to come in the harvests that we won't have in the next 2 or 3 years. And then there are a whole range of other climatic interventions, most recently perhaps the Pakistan floods. And just to give you a tiny example of another one, this morning, and I don't want any sympathy for this, I had to get up at 5 o'clock to arrive here. I live in the East Midlands. I got up at 5 o'clock to find that my village in the East Midlands was flooded. And there's only one road in and one road out, and I was marooned in this village. Now, more important than me being marooned was the fact that on the other side of the water were an Ocado van and 2 vans delivering to the shop and the pub in the village. They won't have got through probably yet. And so some people will be without their grocery supplies. It's Ocado. It's a first world problem. But some people, the pub will not have been able to serve lunch today, and some of the goods for the shop will also not have arrived. When we moved to that village 25 years ago, the brook flooded once every 3 or 4 years. Now it floods 3 or 4 times a year. That is a clear indication of climate change. And it's not just climate change, it's the ability of the logistics to keep up with the change in the climate. It is simply not possible to keep the water out of the streets and onto the fields in the way that it should be. And if that's happening here, just imagine the implications for all of us. And our guests this morning are going to try and address some of those as we go through. Now, I'm going to ask them to keep to time. I'm also going to ask them to be snappy in their answers to the questions. I hope that's okay for all of you. And we're going to start, if we may, with Maurizio Bauer. Maurizio, if you could go first, and I don't know where the clicker is. Well, there it is. Sorry, we found that was my crucial duty, was to keep hold of the clicker. Maurizio.
Well, good morning. Thank you, everyone, for having me here. This is incredible. I'm Mauricio Bauer. I'm the Corporate Sustainability Director of JBS Brazil. My previous role, I spent 12 years in Washington, D.C. I moved now with my family to São Paulo, Brazil, for this position. I was in the NGOs space before. My last position was with WWF in D.C., and before that with NWF, National Wildlife Federation. Well, I have to be brief. My presentation is actually too long, so I'll skip through some of the slides to try to convey my message here. And then I'd be happy to share the presentation with this audience later. Well, climate change is a reality. We're going to have, November 15th, we reached 8 billion people in the planet. We're going to have to find a way to feed all these people while still maintaining the planet. 70% of us by 2050 will be living in cities. There will be an increase in animal protein consumption that is coupled with increase in per capita income. And the solutions that are applicable to one geography, to one reality, will not be applicable to another reality. So the different profiles of different countries will need different solutions for each one. Currently, food is relatively cheap, but 8 million people can't afford it. And we're going to have to produce in the next 40 years the same amount of food that we have produced in the last 8,000 years. So feeding 8 billion people while maintaining the planet in a warmer planet, the solutions that we have today will not be enough in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time. Innovation will be a key component of our strategy for the coming years. This is a forecast for global demand for meat until 2050. We haven't seen a decrease in animal protein consumption since the 60s, if I'm not wrong. So most likely it will not decline. And again, how we see sustainability. Should we choose between a sustainable and non-sustainable product, or should all products be sustainable? So we need to be acting pre-competitively. This is why JBS is currently working with their competitors in the space in Brazil, Marfrig, Minerva, and others, because we're looking for a sector-wide solution. We need to create food systems that are more resilient. And I mean, as a sustainability professional, my role is not to sell rump cap or chicken thighs. I need to produce them with the least possible environmental harm. Selling or competitiveness is to the commercial guys. Again, we need to produce more using less. So JBS is, we have done that before. It's possible. There are plenty of opportunities. This chart is deforestation versus cattle production versus soy production. So we have done that before. We produced more using less, decoupling from deforestation. The tools are there. Everybody that needs to be on the table is on the table. There are plenty of opportunities in Brazil and in South America without the need to knock another tree down. So we can use the available land to produce more. JBS is diversified. We're present in 20 countries, about 500 facilities globally. A significant presence in Europe with Moy Park and Pilgrim's Pride. Environment become the lenses through most business decisions are made. The strategy of JBS is constructed with the environmental lenses. This is one of the reasons I decided to change careers and go back to the company, because I noticed the company was taking significant and strong steps towards becoming more sustainable. And also an opportunity to work the system from within. You can't leave the private sector out of the conversation when you're talking about sustainability and more resilient planet with food systems. We made a net zero commitment by 2040. These are some of the indicators. The company will be net zero by 2040. There are significant investments along those lines. Again, I'm speeding here because I don't have much time. Essentially, scopes 1 and 2 of our emissions are the minority of our emissions. We're tackling it in three different fronts. The majority of our, well, this comes through solutions, technology, innovation, partnerships. Scope 3 is the majority of our emissions, and land use change and enteric fermentation of polygastric animals are the major offenders, and this is why we're focusing our efforts in these three components. Again, food additives to reduction of methane, productivity, increasing in productivity, and crop livestock forestry integration systems are an important component. And on the land use change, enhancing our capabilities of our supply chain governance and control over the supply chain to decouple deforestation from the production of beef is a significant component of that. We found out that by blocking suppliers that offend, that breach our sourcing policy, we have about 15,000 blocked suppliers now. They don't become poets. They don't become filmmakers. They're still ranching cattle and still selling cattle originated from deforestation. So what we have done is we created a network of offices, the green offices, where we provide free of charge assistance for these ranchers to be regularized, to be brought back to legality. And that includes, well, the Brazilian framework that governs that, the Forest Code, has provisions to create a roadmap for reintroduction of producers. And that includes reforestation, that includes a significant number of initiatives that the producer needs to make. What they lack is, in most cases, legal assistance, technical assistance, and we're providing that because it's more interesting for us to transform the cattle value chain, to have these actors within our site than block them and don't see them. This will incentivize a gray market. These are some of the initiatives for reduction of enteric emissions. The most famous one that we announced is Bovaer, which delivers on what it promises. Again, I won't go through the details now. I'm happy to share it later. This is how important, this is just to illustrate how important pasture stewardship is in Brazil. On the left-hand corner, you can see the long roots of the Brazilian grazing system, which sequester carbon in a very powerful way. So maintaining a good pasture is also a very relevant component. Again, comparing the traditional livestock with the modern, we know that very little input and well-known practices, 400 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, a little bit of fence, the productivity enhances, increases, reduction of emissions is present. And then the optimal system where I can actually see negative emissions of carbon is when we combine the best of each one of those systems. On the right-hand side, you can see that. I have a minute and 30 seconds. Again, globally, we're also investing in the decarbonization of the cattle supply chain. We're taking concrete steps on that. This is our monitoring system. I won't go through that right now. I'm happy to answer questions about it. I just want to move to the social aspects of what we're doing. I'd like to give you visibility. Part of the supply chain, especially the smallholders, the actors that are most distant from the major economic systems, the cow-calf operators, the ones in the beginning of the chain, usually are actors with very challenging livelihoods. They live by riverbanks, they're poor, forgotten by the state, forgotten by the market. So JBS developed the JBS Fund for the Amazon to look after those actors in a way that we can reposition the economic incentives at that point. So the relationship with nature for them is positive. Bioeconomy, so the forest is worth more standing than down. Sorry, my voice is going. It's interesting because these actors, especially the smallholders, they don't deforest because they hate forest, they hate nature. That's not the reason. they have a God subsidy, is what they call it. They don't pay for water, they don't pay for the sun, they don't pay for the grass. And when this is depleted, without the proper assistance, the proper guidance, they just go into the forest. That's it. That's natural for them. So we're curating, we're looking after them with the JBS Fund for the Amazon. Again, other initiatives globally that we do. And this is interesting. We have about 5,000 refugees in our workforce in Brazil, 4,000 Venezuelans and 1,000 Haitians. They're fully integrated into Brazilian labor laws, 13 salaries a year, paid vacations, health system. It's all there. And about a year and a half ago, we were made aware of 12 Afghan judges. They were being threatened by the Taliban. When the U.S. left the Afghanistan, Taliban took over, and these Supreme Court justices in Afghanistan had condemned members of the Taliban in their careers, and they were on the verge of being killed. So we were made aware of that by the Association of Brazilian Magistrates, and we deployed R$1 million to bring them and their families to Brazil, and we're supporting them now to incorporate them into the Brazilian legal system. This is something we're very proud of because the social component of our strategy, we have to look after people as well. We also have a school, free of charge school for the lower income part of the society. The kids have not only the regular subjects of the Brazilian curriculum, but also business subjects. So it's an MBA for kids. And it's really interesting to go there and visit. These people come from very challenging realities, and when you talk to them, it's perfect English. They have concepts of finance at a very young age, and they leave the school as executives already. That's it. 2 minutes after over. Sorry, guys.
Don't worry. What Maurizio didn't mention, because he didn't have time, is that JBS this year became the world's largest food company. And it's impressive and encouraging to see the kind of initiatives that sit behind that. And we'll have more chance to talk about that in a minute. I'm going to ask Alexander now from Embrapa Soybean to take us forward. There we are. Thank you, Alexander.
Very much. Can you hear me? Yep. Oh, if you don't mind, I'm going to stand here. Thank you very much for the invitation, Ambassador. It's
Alexander,
a pleasure.
keep an eye on that, though.
Oh, for sure. It's a pleasure to be here. And my name is Alexandre Pomuceno. I'm a researcher at Embrapa for 34 years, and now I became the head of the National Soybean Research Center. And very quickly, I will try to give you some overview about the Brazilian agriculture. Just to remind you, Brazil is the 6th in population, 7th in GDP, 50 in size. We have all those biomes. As you know, the Amazon is the most famous. Those are the areas where you sow grains in Brazil. And as you can see in the second picture, you must preserve the Amazon forest because it's important by its biodiversity, but most of the humidity that brings rain to our grain production in the center of Brazil in the south comes from the Amazon region. So if you destroy that, you're not being producing any more grains. Probably you don't know, but Brazil have one of the toughest legislations in terms of forest code. In the south, the producers must preserve 20% of its area. In the north, 8%. And these numbers were showed here before. With that, Brazil is preserving 66% of its vegetal area, native preserved area, while in Europe, 20%, and in the United States, 20%. Of course, you have problems, but our biggest problems are law enforcement. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. If you put in terms of size of countries, only the areas where the producers must preserve it corresponds to 10 European countries. And if you look at all the preservation area in Brazil, around 43 countries. In terms of use of land to produce food, Brazil uses around 7.6% of its area to produce food, not only to Brazil. Usually, I mean, we are talking about to feed around 1 billion people with the food produced in Brazil, and we can compare with other countries. In terms of carbon emissions, we all know the biggest problem with carbon emissions are the energy production. Agriculture, it's a problem, but the biggest problem is energy production. And when you look at the Brazilian agriculture, it corresponds to 1.9% of the emissions in the whole planet. The total emissions in Brazil is around 2.9, around 3% of the emissions. Actually, we're the 7th country in terms of emissions in the globe. And if you go more deeply at the Brazilian emissions, you can see, yes, we have problems mainly with land use, some areas of the deforestation, mainly illegal deforestation. You have a large problem with land grabbing, illegal loggers, illegal miners, but our government is dealing very toughly with that. I'm sure we're going to be solving these problems, but again, preservation of the Amazon and all those areas is as important for us as for the whole planet. Well, like I said, I work at the Brazilian Agricultural Research Corporation. Now I became the head of the National Soybean Research Center. We are a public institution in Brazil. We are a branch of the Brazilian, a branch of the Ministry of Agriculture in Brazil. We do research, and by doing that, we are able, in the last 50 years, not only Embrapa, but other institutions, to increase by 407% the production of grains in Brazil, increasing only 64% of there. That means lots of technology, research, and development put in place. By doing that, with the production of grains, we increase corn by 5% in the last 40 to 50 years, 8% of soybean, and by doing that, producing this amount of grains, we were able also to increase, like we saw before here, the amount of meat produced. Brazil today is the biggest exporter of meat in the world. We also improve the use of our pastures. Brazil have around 167 million hectares of pastures. Around half of that are degraded pasture, because before 30 years before, in 1 hectare you couldn't have one cow. Now you can have around 2 to 3, 4, depending on the system you are using. So we improve the use of our pastures. So these pastures that are not being used anymore can be used for grain production. Today, this season, we are planting 42 million hectares of soybean. If you start to look of the degraded pastures in Brazil, you have more than 60 to 70 million hectares that can be used not only for soybean, for other crops, for systems where you have integrated pastures, cattle raising, forests, and grain production. Well, by doing all this development, Brazil became today the first sugar producer exporter, first in coffee, first in orange juice, and beef, poultry, and corn. You saw the data before. And for soybean, we are the first producer and the first exporter for the world. Soybean is the cheapest source of protein for the planet. I challenge everybody here to show another source of protein in the amounts that we have produced by Brazil, Argentina, Canada, and United States. So with this protein, you can have protein of better quality that you have in the animal meats. And if you look at the soybean production in the world, 90% come from the Americas. Why you need to produce so much soybean? People ask, why you don't plant food instead of soybean? But that's one of the reasons, because soybean is used to animal feed. And you see more and more the use of soybean for biodiesel. In Brazil, 80% of the biodiesel come from soybean, and you will start to see the use of biotechnology, that's my expertise field, genome editing and other strategies to change the quality of the soybean oil and become an oil that's more interesting to use, for example, for biofuel in airplanes, to produce other products like tires. The Goodyear just put in Brazil now tires using soybean oil. Those are the big importers of our soybean. How sustainable is now our soybean? I believe there is no other countries that can have 360 days a year producing food like in Brazil. Photosynthesis, getting the CO2 from the atmosphere, producing food, and you are using mainly those kind of systems. It's a no-tillage system you can see here. You're harvesting corn and harvesting soybean, and behind you come planting corn. No tillage systems like this one, you can sequestrate in the soil amounts around 3 to 6 tons of CO2 equivalent of carbon in the soil, and we can do that 365 days a year. Another thing that you use in the Brazilian soybean production is the nitrogen biological fixation. You don't use chemical nitrogen, fossil nitrogen. You have this symbiosis that a bacteria gets the nitrogen from the air and gives to the soybean plant. By doing that, this season, 42 million hectares that you're going to be planting, you are not putting in the atmosphere 223 million tons of CO2 equivalent that are not put in the atmosphere just by using nitrogen fixation, biological nitrogen fixation. Those numbers are published in some of the journals. To show these sustainable numbers that we have in Brazil, we created that program, just started the low carbon soybean program. I don't have time to give details here, but it's a program that the Embrapa is building up with the 7 big institutions, corporations from the private sector. So you want to show in numbers those things that I just presented you in terms of sustainability of the Brazilian soybean. We have mapped all over the Brazil the baseline for soybean production, how much in terms of emissions each area in Brazil produces in terms of soybean production. So for each area in Brazil, we have 5 micro regions for soybean production. You can see the publications over there. So we are using this information to map for each area the producers that are applying the best sustainable practices. They will have some kind, it's not some kind, it will be a certification that shows that in that area that is producing, he is not putting X amounts of CO2 equivalent to the atmosphere. You are in the first phase, you are building up this certification program, and later we're going to try to spread over the country to see to increase the number of producers that use the best practices in soybean production. All this information is based in science, in publications made by Brazilian scientists, many times published in partnership with other countries like England and other countries in Europe, and that's how we're going to be doing. And we have programs for other crops as well, for coffee, for milk, and for meat, cotton, leather, and calves. And just to finish, for you to know us, Embrapa Soybean Center is located in the south of Brazil, the north of Paraná State. This is an overview of our research institution. I like to say that we are the biggest research center for soybean in the world. I have been traveling a lot, and we have 60 scientists, all with PhDs, concentrated working with soybean research in this place in Brazil. Thank you very much.
Alexander, thank you very much. And the last 2 speakers we've heard are specifically from Brazil. We're going to slightly change gear here. And our next 3 speakers will be from the UK. We're going to have James McCulloch from the Agricultural Industries Confederation, which represents a whole range of UK agriculture. Then we're going to hear from Anna from Tesco. And then we're going to hear from DEFRA, the ministry which commands, I suppose, the UK agriculture scene. But James, first of all, from the Agricultural Industries Confederation.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian.
I think we can hear you.
You can? Good. And thank you, Mr. Ambassador Hugo, and the rest of the team here for giving me the opportunity to...
No, it's not working. Try mine.
Yeah.
Use mine.
Okay. Is this one on? This one is on. Yeah, excellent. Good. So thank you very much for the opportunity to address you today. Again, I think that the themes that we've picked up already is this, I guess one might call it as tension between delivering sustainability in food supply chains at the same time as delivering food security. And it's something that we're, I guess, grappling with here in the UK. And I'm specifically here to look at through the prism of soya. And soya for use in animal feed. So I represent the animal feed sector at Agricultural Industries Confederation. Forgive the short advertorial on AIC in terms of a trade association. We're a UK-based trade association effectively looking after the input trade. So if you think of all the things that farmers, be they arable or livestock farmers, need to grow their crops or produce their livestock, then we represent those industries that provide those inputs, and we would have 95% coverage of the UK market with an input value of around £8 billion. I guess that if one looked at commodity market prices over the last few months, then I'd have to revise that figure. We are obviously a trade association and a lobbyist association. We have 650 MPs on our political database. It's a full-time job keeping that up to date over the last 6 months because there have been plenty of changes, as you're fully aware. We run assurance, food and feed assurance schemes in the UK. That's also a vital link of being able to demonstrate not only feed and food safety, but also we're starting to look at requirements to bring sustainability into the whole assurance network. So that's something that we're obviously looking at. And we do have a register of feed advisors, so 40-odd thousand conversations every day on farm between farmers and feed suppliers around obviously nutrition, but also around the sustainable aspects of nutrition. Those are the various sectors. As I say, I represent the animal feed sector. We're producing roughly 16 million tonnes of animal feed here in the UK, and of that proportion, around 53% is locally grown, 47% is imported. So as you can see, we are to an extent reliant on imports for certain classes of animal proteins. So it's already been mentioned by Alexandra, but why is soya regarded as such a first-class ingredient for animal feed? The high protein content's already been discussed and mentioned. It's not just about protein. The amino acid profile of soya is extremely valuable and important for animal nutrition. And then, of course, you've got the commercial aspects of soya, which is meaning that it's available in extremely large volumes, as, again, we've seen the data on the levels of supply, and the quality in terms of consistency, and it's a commercially attractive offer. So it's extremely important to the animal feed industry, and we think it'll remain important to the animal feed industry. And part of our role is, I think, to defend the use of responsibly sourced soya in livestock diets. There are plenty of calls, not just in the UK, but in other parts of the world, which say that simply taking soya out of the livestock diet is an answer to all of our problems. We would say that that is not the case, and that the value of soy in the diet will continue to be relied upon. So we are there to defend, I think, the use of responsibly sourced soya. Not to say that we're not interested in, obviously, alternative proteins, novel proteins that are coming down the stream, but the scale of the requirement on soya means that we will continue to be reliant on it for some time. Just looking at where that soya goes into UK livestock diets, poultry would be the major user here, and again very similar to the information that Alexandra showed in his slides in terms of a global picture. Then followed by the pork sector, and then and dairy and so forth. We have quite a strong aquaculture sector here in the UK for basically salmon diets, and there's obviously a fair proportion of soy going into salmon diets. In terms of origins, this is data that we gather as part of an ARC soy supply group, which is effectively the major traders, importers and suppliers of soya. And that just shows the breakdown of where we get our soya from. So again, a reasonable split between South American, North American origins. In terms of, I think the major message that I wanted to get across in the efforts to drive for sustainable supply chains and sustainable soya within those supply chains is that it's essential that the whole of the supply chain is involved in that collaboration. So all the way from production right through to retailer in the UK. It's very important that we maintain collaboration across that supply chain, so that we can all move forward to the objective that we're wanting to achieve in terms of sustainable soya, without presenting stresses and challenges to the supply chain. One example of I guess to avoid was the non-GM soya example some years ago, where there was I think an unprepared for and mass move or request for non-GM soya in the UK, which resulted in quite significant market shock. And it was an issue where clearly, had there been some collaboration, I'll get that word right in a minute, collaboration across the supply chain, then that would not have happened. So that's what, in terms of being able to deliver sustainable soya, we're trying to avoid. In terms of the current plan that we have, we're developing and involved in developing here in the UK. It's quite a busy slide, this, but I'll just run through it quickly. This is we have a UK soy roundtable, which is convened by UK government here in the UK, and it's been an extremely valuable and useful platform to discuss issues surrounding delivering sustainable soya. That has spawned other initiatives, such as the UK Soy Manifesto, which has delivered commitments around verified and deforestation and conversion-free soya. And we, as a feed industry, are working with the Manifesto group and the Roundtable to try and effectively deliver what you can see in the orange box here, a national transition plan. The various elements to that plan would include establishing an agreed definition of what we mean by verified deforestation and conversion-free soya. We, as AIC and our AIC Soy Supply Group, are supplying data, and we'll be creating a quarterly report on soya imports, so that we have effectively a baseline profile of soya, and an element of that will be soya that is in transition in terms of transition from non-verified deforestation conversion-free to verified. We mentioned assurance earlier. We're looking at producing a verified deforestation conversion-free assurance standard, so that there is an independent audit trail for those supplies of soya to that standard. All of this can only really happen with the buy-in and acceptance of all parties in the supply chain, which is where the National Transition Plan comes in. And we all effectively sit around a table and discuss how we're going to deliver it and the timescale over which we're going to deliver it. And I think this is the important sort of message here, is that if everybody can effectively leave their weapons at the door and come in and discuss these things, then we can develop a plan which can be delivered. We've all got the same aim. It's just a question of how and when it can be achieved. In terms of progress to date, this is data for 2020 soya imports, just giving you a breakdown of roughly 2.4 million tonnes of soybean meal imported into the UK, just over 500,000 tonnes from territories carrying no risk of deforestation, another 870,000 tonnes compliant with supply schemes that carry a zero deforestation standard, and then another proportion which is of soy imported compliant with ASM, or Amazon Soy Moratorium requirements, leaving a proportion of around 700,000 tonnes where there is a lack of verification. If one applies an assessment of the risk of any association with deforestation of that soy, that takes 650,000 tonnes of that into what we might call a low-risk category, leaving around 60,000 tonnes, or 2.5% of the total imports that might be considered at risk. So in other words, with our national transition plan, we're focusing on the 30%, not the 70%. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Now, in many ways, the key individual in this whole thing at the end of the supply chain is the shopper. Not the consumer, but the shopper, in my view, because it's the shopper who makes the decision on behalf of the consumers. And we have a very important representative of the shopper and our means of getting there here. Anna from Tesco, and those of you who are active in the UK will know that Tesco has an absolutely pivotal role in the way in which shoppers understand sustainability. So Anna, over to you.
Thanks, Ian. No pressure. Lovely to be here. Thank you so much, Ambassador, and everyone at the Embassy for having us and hosting this morning, and for the amazing cheese bread that I can never pronounce the name of, but I love it. So it was great to see it this morning. Exactly. Thank you, Rodrigo. So, as Ian says, I represent Tesco. Tesco is the UK's largest retailer. We have 27% market share in the UK, and are also present and have operations in the Republic of Ireland, in Central Europe, and we have a group of companies that span wholesale right the way through to telecommunications, banking, as well as grocery retail, which is our biggest business. I'd like to spend a little bit of time today, I guess, laying out the rationale for the why. Because the issues that we have been talking about this morning are becoming much more omnipresent in the minds of the consumer and of the Tesco shopper, of the customer. And actually, Maurizio, in his presentation, mentioned that, you know, the role that social media is now playing, but I cannot underscore that enough, because that is now the reality that we are facing into as a business. So let me start with the kind of what we're seeing day to day, and hope that my slides work. So there's a lot of campaigning attention on Tesco at the moment, because we're the biggest, because we're the most visible, and that's kind of right. You know, that's the campaigning theory of change. You go after the biggest, and then you make the biggest move, and then the rest follow. But actually, we know that the issues that we are dealing with today are inherently complex. They require systemic changes to the way in which we produce and we consume. And it requires an all-of-industry collaboration, to James's earlier point as well. We can't do this on our own. We cannot solve deforestation, but we can have a damn good go at it. And so this is just some current imagery that you can see in relation to some campaigning that's going on at the moment against Tesco. What you can see from that is actually it's incredibly creative, but it's also incredibly emotive. And it actually really directly targets our shoppers. And when you see these kind of images, it's very hard to ignore it. But as a retailer, we're not ignoring it, and we haven't been ignoring this for years. So let me kind of take a step back to the origin story, I guess, of the Tesco responsible sourcing journey, and then maybe we can kind of weave back through to where we are today. So back in 2010, so more than 12 years ago now, we set a zero net deforestation commitment for our forest risk commodities. That includes palm oil, soy, timber products, as well as beef. And those commodities were really identified as having the greatest risk of deforestation and land conversion associated with their production, and also the corresponding significance of the volumes that were being bought into Tesco or sold into Tesco. Now, by far and away, soy remains our biggest forest risk commodity. And that's because of its links to the animal protein supply chain and animal feed for livestock. In fact, it's more than 99% of our 99% of our soy footprint comes from animal feed. Now, Tesco may be the largest retailer, but we don't own and directly control our agricultural supply chains. We do not have integrated supply chains. Some retailers do, other businesses do, we don't. We're buying on the open market, we're buying through contracts with our direct suppliers, who are then contracting through their suppliers and their suppliers. That means that our ability to influence and to exert leverage for the changes we need to see, in particular, to ensure verified and conversion-free soy application through those supply chains is mixed. And it's made more difficult by the complexity of the supply chains that we're facing into, because we know that agricultural supply chains are not homogeneous. They are very, very different. So if we look at our soy supply chain and we look at those livestock categories, what you can see here on the screen is really the way in which they manifest, I guess, and the way in which we have to interact with them as Tesco. Poultry, it's our biggest soy kind of consumer, if you like, by supply chain. And actually, it has the greatest ability currently to give us information around specification of origin and trader that is involved in the exchange process, because the supply chains are more integrated. But when you start to look at other supply chains, such as pork or dairy or beef, that visibility, that traceability and transparency back up the supply chain rapidly decreases. And therefore, our ability to be able to know where that soy has come from and how it's been grown is actually really limited. And that's why we actually have to work together on this one. We cannot do this on our own. So for us, we've very much come on a journey in terms of our deforestation agenda. And we've taken a phased approach. Back in 2018, at the start of our kind of deforestation agenda for soy, it was really important that we used our buying power and our brand power to send a really strong market signal. That we wanted to see market demand, we wanted to demonstrate market demand for sustainably certified soy in specific supply chains. And we did that through the adoption of our soy requirement for our suppliers. Once we had established a good baseline, we then moved into this period that we're in now, which is around transformation and ultimately how we deliver on the commitment we have to ensure that all soy meal in our UK supply chains comes from verified deforestation and conversion-free areas by 2025. Now that's really, really tricky because of all the reasons that I've already mentioned, but also because of the complexities and the realities that our suppliers and their suppliers are facing into in our supply chains. So we know right now that data remains tricky. It's a challenge to get status in terms of the soy that is being used in those supply chains. We know that certification can be expensive, particularly when you look at segregation of supply. So how do we think about that and where that money, how that information and the cost is borne across the supply chain? We also know that it's really tricky to build capacity and capability within the supply chains consistently to be able to deliver on that standard of practice and supply. But also, importantly, the level of information and clarity around origin remains challenging today for reasons that I'm sure most of you will be far more familiar with than I am. So how are we going about trying to deliver on this transformation within the Tesco supply chain? We've spent a lot of time working with our direct suppliers. We've also spent a lot of time influencing and advocating for the changes we need to see. Over the last 24 months, we've worked with all of our key livestock supply chains and our suppliers with significant soy footprints to actually establish individual supplier roadmaps that start to get our suppliers thinking about what they need to be looking for in order to deliver on verified DCF soy. Not just about the levers that we already know, such as certification, but how they can start to actually build shared accountability, back up the supply chain by asking the right questions. Because at the moment, if you dig into the middle of a UK livestock supply chain, the chances are those processors won't know what feed is coming in, where it's coming from, or really about the issues associated with its production. So how can we actually deliver on verified DCF soy for Tesco and for wider industry? Obviously, Tesco sourcing requirements are fundamental. They set the baseline expectation that we ask all of our suppliers to adhere to. And we continue to strengthen those supplier requirements year on year. But you can only strengthen your own supplier requirements as much as you can also move the wider industry, because you don't want to disproportionately burden the supply chain or put undue expectation on them that they can't actually deliver on. So that's why we need sector-based initiatives such as the UK Soy Manifesto that James mentioned earlier and that Tesco is a founding member of. We need a critical mass of all of retail, all of manufacturing, all of food processing, right the way back up the chain to signal that we need and demand a higher quality level of soy imports into the UK market. We also need innovative financing, and that's why we will also have put £5 million of initial investment into a pilot in Brazil in the Responsible Commodities Facility, which is looking at how we can stimulate and incentivize Brazilian soy farmers to keep forests standing and land from being cleared, but by using commercial financing mechanisms, and certainly not by telling Brazilian farmers what to do from afar, because we know that that is not the way to go about it. And actually Grace from SIM is here today. If anyone is interested to understand more about the RCF, please do. We're also joined by another couple of UK retailers that are investing in this pilot fund to basically establish proof of concept in order to scale. And then finally, effective legislation. We'll hear more from Leila from DEFRA on the UK due diligence law, but we also know we've got EU due diligence legislation coming as well. That is going to set a floor in order to level the playing field. Where we need to go is we need to elevate it. The burden it's going to place on us as retailers and as downstream companies is going to be great. So we need all the tools in the toolbox to be able to actually deliver on that legislative compliance. And one final word, I guess, just back to what James was saying on standards. I understand that AIC has actually got the draft verified DCF standard ready to go. And as Tesco, we look absolutely forward to seeing that in the coming days, because we need to have transparent standards across all of industry so that we can move together, reduce cost, but also deliver on the outcomes we need to see. Thank you.
Anna, thank you very much. Now we're going to hear from DEFRA. It isn't Leila, but I know we're going to... It is. Oh, goodness, I didn't recognise you. Sorry. I'm very sorry about that. I didn't recognise you. You have a very different role in this whole setup, because in some ways you're the most important influencer in this whole process, but also you have obligations which others of our speakers don't have. And I think we appreciate that some of this is going to be, when we get to the questions, this might be a more tricky, how shall I put this, a tricky platform for you to take. So we're very grateful to you for your presentation, and I realise that it might not answer all the questions that some people may have.
Is this working? Yes, just about. Fantastic. Thanks, Ian, and thank you to the Embassy for hosting. We're really glad to be here today. I'm Leila Denniston. I work at DEFRA. I'm a technical lead on the due diligence project. But we also have senior representation in the room. Laura Bellingham here at the front is very much looking forward to meeting many of you during the networking parts of today. And several of my colleagues, if I can ask them to give a little wave so that you know where to look for them, are also here to meet you later on. The due diligence legislation, as mentioned, aims to help address illegal deforestation in our supply chains associated with consumption here in the UK, and to really complement the industry initiatives that we've heard a little bit about already. It aims to level that playing field to make sure that those that are investing in doing the right thing aren't being undermined or undercut by those that aren't, either here in the UK or down the supply chain. Just briefly, over the next 9 minutes or so, I'm going to give you a bit of background to this domestic legislative project, set out what the primary legislation says, so the backbone to the legislative project, which is in the Environment Act that passed into law in 2021, talk a bit about the next steps, so the implementation of that legislation, and offer up an email address that I imagine many of you will be in touch with over the next few weeks. So on that background, we've heard this already today, but a really significant amount of deforestation globally is still conducted in violation with national and local laws. And we know that in the UK, apart from for timber, there is no legal requirement on businesses using commodities, particularly agricultural commodities, that are often associated with that deforestation, to check how they've been produced. So we consulted back in 2020 to see whether there was support to introduce new domestic legislation to help tackle that illegal deforestation. And indeed, there was widespread support, and that led to the introduction of primary provisions in the Environment Act, which passed into law in 2021. It's worth also mentioning we know that this domestic piece of legislation is only one part of a bigger picture, and it can only do so much to help transition supply chains, which is why it sits in a bigger package of work that I won't touch on in this presentation, because you're going to hear from my colleague Martine at Bayes in the second panel. So look forward to hearing more from her on that package. Let's talk about the primary legislation. At the core of our approach to this new domestic measure is partnership. We recognize that forest countries in particular should have the most agency over how they manage their natural resources. And for that reason, the first requirement set out in our primary provisions is a prohibition on using commodities that have been produced in breach of local laws. So here we're talking about local laws on land use, land ownership, to help address that deforestation where it's taking place illegally. Secondly, for those businesses that use these key regulated commodities, in order to understand the risk of being in breach of that prohibition, there is a requirement that they carry out a due diligence exercise. So the primary specifies that they'll need to collect information about those commodities that they use, assess the risk that they may have been produced in breach of local laws on land use and ownership, and then mitigate those risks that they encounter. How then can we enforce that here in the UK? Those businesses will be required to publish, to submit an annual report, and part of that annual report will be made available to the public each year to add scrutiny and enable enforcement. I think it's worth mentioning that that primary legislation has the ability to capture both raw commodities, these agricultural commodities associated with deforestation, but also products that are derived from them. Often we refer to these as embedded commodities as well. And that's because a really significant part of our deforestation risk footprint here in the UK is in fact embedded in products, in commodities that use raw goods either as an ingredient or a component part. But it's also worth mentioning, because we have legislation already in place for timber, the UK timber regulations, they're not in scope of this new legislative project. That primary legislation isn't operational until we lay what's called secondary legislation. So the primary sets out the backbone, the principles, the foundation of the law, and the secondary legislation is what is needed to set out details on how it will then be implemented. In this case, that will set out many of the key details, including which commodities will be in scope. The primary simply offers a definition of a forest risk commodity, and in secondary we can then capture the latest trends in deforestation to make sure that we can capture those where they change. It will set out which businesses will be subject to provisions, further information on how the due diligence requirement will operate, as well as how they'll need to report on that due diligence exercise and how the regime will be enforced to ensure that it's effective. Earlier this year, we launched a public consultation, which closed in March, to inform all of the decisions in those areas. And I want to just touch briefly on some of the proposals that I think are most relevant to those in the room today. I want to touch, first of all, on the forest risk commodity part of that proposal. Essentially, because we have the ability to capture different commodities via secondary legislation, we have the ability to take a phased approach, to introduce some and capture others over time to make sure that we're learning from this new legislation as we go. And in that consultation, we identified that there is widespread consensus over a core group of commodities that are seen globally to be driving deforestation. And off the top of my head, I can try and list those 7. They're cattle and associated products, cocoa, coffee, soy, palm oil, rubber, and maize. I always have to count them out to make sure I don't miss one. And we sought views on whether those ought to be the ones that we take into account to consider for initial regulation, but also opened up a question as to whether we were missing key evidence to factor in that additional evidence in our considerations. I've said already that we have the ability to take a phased approach, and I don't yet have answers on which commodities will come when, but we're looking forward to providing more information on that in due course. In terms of which businesses are captured, again, I wanted to flag here that because we want to target those that have the most influence over their supply chain, so have the ability to invest and support supply chains to transition towards more sustainable practices, we intend in the first instance at least to capture those larger businesses that have more resources to do so. So we have the ability to set a turnover threshold, to establish a point above which businesses will be captured, and also the ability to establish an exemption based on volume, recognizing that some of those larger businesses that may in some ways have an ability to exert influence over their supply chain may be limited if in fact they only use a very small amount of a regulated commodity. And the final part of the consultation proposal I wanted to at least proactively touch on, there may be opportunities to touch on more in the question and answer section, is the due diligence system itself. I think we recognize that we are bringing forwards brand new legislation in this space, and that supply chains that may be regulated through this come with different degrees of maturity at this point. So we want to ensure that we are offering businesses across supply chains the flexibility to assess and mitigate the risks that are relevant to them, and make sure that the burdens that are placed on businesses in the initial period are very much proportionate to their ability to influence their supply chains. So under this, we were encouraged at consultation on the primary legislation to introduce a risk mitigation level, so help support businesses to understand how far they need to go in assessing and mitigating risk in their supply chains. And the proposal in this space is one which offers businesses flexibility to really look at their own supply chains and tailor that due diligence exercise to the risks that they encounter and therefore the risks that they need to mitigate. I'll stop there on the sort of details of those proposals, but just to flag, in June this year, we published a summary of the responses that we received to that consultation, and we'll be taking into account the wider range of views that we received in determining the details of that secondary legislation. In that summary of responses, however, the government did commit to proceeding to legislate at the earliest opportunity, and set out that more information on what the details of the secondary legislation will follow in due course. A minute to go, not too bad. Just in terms of next steps, I think it's worth emphasizing that the consultation focused simply on the first round of secondary legislation, because the details are set in, or the framework is set in primary with the ability to establish details in secondary. We're able to bring forwards multiple rounds of secondary legislation if needs be, and that 2 years after introducing legislation for the first time, we'll be required to review it, and then every 2 years on from then, to make sure that it's having the effect that we want it to have. I've said this already, but we're committed to implementing these provisions at the earliest opportunity, and partnership really is at the core of that based on this prohibition, so tying the standard to the local legal framework in forested countries. But it's also worth noting that businesses that are captured in scope will have a transition period so that they have time to adjust, if needs be, their supply chains. More information to come in due course, but if you're looking for more now, you can go onto gov.uk to find out more about the consultation and the summary of responses that I've touched on briefly. And there is an email address up on the screen as well. We're just updating our contact list, so please do drop a knock to that address if you'd like to be added to it, and that further information will come your way. Thank you.
If there were a prize, Leila, you would have just won it for being bang on the 10 minutes. Now, Ugo, I'm looking at you. We may have to run on a little bit in order to take some questions, so just to be clear about that, we may run on 10 or 12 minutes longer than we're scheduled to do. Rodrigo, thank you for waiting for so long. I hope you found it edifying, and now let's hear from you.
Thank you so much. Can I have the
clicker?
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Ambassador, and for the invitation. And it's my pleasure to address this audience. I just arrived from COP27 in Egypt, and as probably some of you. And one of the big topics there was food security. There's a decision on agriculture and climate change, including food security, creating a platform for countries to bring their proposals, actions, policies towards addressing this insecurity of climate change and impacts on food production. And I think plenty of what we heard today relates to this goal. And I will try to address one of the big issues here, that is how to trace back deforestation to allow supply chains and to allow consumers to be informed about this issue when it comes to sustainable development. So I think some of the presentations already touched upon some specific topics I will bring, but I think it's extremely important when we are talking about land use in Brazil and deforestation in Brazil to try to understand the complexity about what is deforestation, who causes deforestation, where does deforestation takes place, and how much supply chains are connected to deforestation. So the first slide is the Amazon deforestation rates. Deforestation was peaking again. It arrived at 4,571 in 2012 and 9, and now we have a bad figure, and the state of Pará and the state of Amazonas are the biggest states, Mato Grosso as well, despite Mato Grosso it's doing a lot of work to couple with this. And this is for me more the granularity of deforestation, and I think this is extremely important when we want to try to address deforestation in supply chains. Because this is on average, and the 68% here of deforestation, considering the 2009 figures, takes place on public lands, and around 32% on private lands. This has several implications when we want to trace back and we want to mitigate risks of deforestation in imports. Why? Because the challenges and what must be done to tackle deforestation in public lands is different from the private lands. And there's all the debate of legal and illegal deforestation as well. And for me, I think it's extremely important to stress that this green part of the graphic here are public non-designated land in the Amazon, which is around 35% of deforestation in the Amazon per year, which poses a huge challenge towards law enforcement against illegal deforestation. And those guys that are there clearing those type of land are not formal producers taking credit at the bank and investing in production, because this is totally an illegal world that must be managed and must be avoided. And when we see, okay, those are the big figures. And now when we see Brazil and how Brazil considers deforestation into climate change, when Brazil presented its actions at the first nationally determined contribution in 2015, Brazil presented a climate change reduction target that now it's updated, 50% reductions up to 2030 based on the 25 levels, and climate neutrality up to 2050. It's a very ambitious target. It's a economy-wide target. And to do that, what Brazil proposed, zero illegal deforestation. It was 2030, and last year Brazil anticipated to 2028. So zero illegal 2028. Restoration of 18 million hectares of forest for multiple purposes. Compensate emissions from legal deforestation. And this, in my view, I am an international lawyer, from a treaty binding target that we have, from a treaty perspective, at the Paris Agreement, we have a target to tackle illegal deforestation. This is 0 and must be narrowed to 0. But we are allowed in our forest code regulation and in our target at the Paris Agreement to have legal deforestation, and we will compensate emissions because restoration. Of course, we need to be able to put this in practice and bring formal reports and data to prove that we are following this path. Promote sustainable forest management, implement the forest code, produce and conserve approach. I'll bring more insights about this. Implement the ABC plan, the low carbon agricultural plan, that allows to reach 72.6 million hectares of areas adopting low carbon technologies that will allow adaptation and mitigation, allowing to reduce up to 1 billion tons of CO2 equivalent up to 2030. And as I brought here 18% of biofuels, which will be equivalent to 50 billion liters of biofuels in 2030 to support decarbonization in Brazil. This is considered at the energy sector, but it is produced on farms, so that's why I brought here as well. So this is ambitious. And when it comes to trying to trace back deforestation, I think if we consider that production takes place on private lands, and mostly it is, there are some specific cases that we need to address in conservation units, for example, we need to look back and see what regulation do we have to bring a positive information, a reliable information about deforestation on private lands. And we have the Forest Code as a basis for land use information, because we have the Rural Environmental Registry, the so famous CAR in Portuguese, the environmental compliance programs at the states, the terms of compromise that each producer that has to restore some part of its farm will need to sign, and this is a binding commitment, legally binding commitment. And there's estimates showing that around 27 million hectares of native vegetation on private lands. I think Ricardo and Alexandre brought this figure. This is an estimation. We need to validate the CAR. This is the process of the Forest Code, which we call the compliance process. And so the CAR, it's the official source of information regarding land use status. The CAR validation is a key challenge to push forward the compliance process. The CAR will allow to separate legal from illegal deforestation, which in my view is extremely important, and by doing that work as an official source of information for banks, companies, and other stakeholders. Last year it was published Environmental Regularization Mode module at the Forest Service, attached with a card to be able to push forward the compliance process. And one thing that happened this year is the creation of this Regularizagro, that is the National Plan for Environmental Regularization of Rural Properties, comprising different ministries, not just the Ministry of Agriculture, but the Ministry of Environment, Ministry, I believe there are 6 ministries that are connected at this group, because this is a huge, important policy for Brazil. There are 6.7 million cars, which is totally not the exact figure, because we have around 5 million rural properties, so there's a lot of our cars are together for several reasons, double counting. That's why validation is extremely important. Mato Grosso analyzed 25% of the cars, São Paulo 61%, and push forward the car validation. It's a go or no-go step towards the implementation of the law. And I'm always there. So deforestation-free and or risk mitigation strategies, because otherwise there's no silver bullet to tackle this. Otherwise we will not be here talking about this from multiple perspectives. So any deforestation-free or risk mitigation would probably need to address cutoff dates, legal or illegal deforestation, definition of deforestation and or conversion of natural habitats, traceability, how to trace deforestation, tools and approaches to traceability of deforestation, mandatory requirements such as due diligence, we just heard from DEFRA, voluntary sustainability standard certification schemes, which brings a huge complexity, only considering countries' regulations, not talking about stakeholders' approaches and private approaches, because this is a figure trying to pass the following message. The UK has a specific design for its due diligence. Regulation is being dealt with. We just heard from DEFRA, and when UK approved its regulation, this will go that way. Then now we have the US doing a public consultation as well, up to December 2 of December in the coming weeks. So the US will adopt its cutoff date, its concept, and so on. Then we have the EU regulation trying to do this, and we will have probably some overlapping concepts and approaches, and probably different ones. So is it feasible to find a common approach towards the deforestation traceability, thinking about the war and addressing this as a global problem? Different approaches and measures would follow the TBT agreement of the WTO. Countries' regulations should not pose disproportionate burden over operators. Regulations could adopt voluntary standards as a manner to assure low-risk deforestation, and how countries' targets at the Paris Agreement will contribute to this goal. Here, I'm finishing. So Brazil, it has this target illegal in 2028 that was brought in Glasgow last year. There's all the Glasgow commitments to forests, and now the COP27, the Forest and Climate Leaderships Partnership, the agriculture sector roadmap to 1.5 degrees, the Rainforest Protection Pact, Brazil, Indonesia, and Congo. So there's several different approaches trying to get to exactly the same objective. How to enforce and to build this, and in my view, this is critically important. Enable to reduce the risk of deforestation associated with commodities. Again, there's no silver bullet. Avoid burdensome costs to operators and consumers, paperwork and costs, because otherwise someone will pay the bill. Avoid trade disruptions and barriers. Take into account regulatory measures that allow to minimize risks and bring consistent information regarding deforestation, such as the Forest Code and the CAR in Brazil, and other detailed official deforestation data, of course, and consider cooperation as a manner to build trust and effectively contribute to tackle deforestation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Now, we've got about 10 minutes tops for questions. I have some questions, but I'd like to see people's hands up, because if we do have questions, I can take those instead. But since none of you have put your hand up, I'm going to ask everybody a question. I can see. Yes. Have you got a mic, or am I giving them the mic? Ah, there we are. Yeah. And then we'll come to you, Sarah. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Luke Ryder, and I'm here representing the Satellite Applications Catapult. My interest is the use of satellite data to shine a spotlight on sustainability and traceability. I recently had the privilege of visiting Brazil, and I'd like to thank Embrapa Soja for their hosting me when I visited Londrina to learn about the Low Carbon Soy Initiative. My question, however, is around what is the solution. On the one hand, we've learnt today about the very complex supply chain that includes lots of elevators and suitably lots of chaos. And on the other hand, we have a lot of significant number of supply chain initiatives coming from the EU and the UK, and one believes everyone wants to be the first to be able to supply and say and advocate that they're supplying are advocating that they're sourcing non-deforested soy. What's the panel's view, however, on the need for a universal and globally recognised sustainability and traceability mark? And can we afford to wait so long for one to be created?
Okay, who'd like to take that first? None of you? Go on.
Yeah, thank you for that. Obviously, I was focusing on soya and the complexity of the supply chain. Yet certainly, what we've tried to do is consider a national standard or a national transition plan, and that's proving to be quite challenging. So, whether a global plan is credible, I mean, certainly it should be something that one could and should consider. The whole question around verification, whether it's satellite technology or other, is where one has to get into the very fine detail and ensure that supply chains in their entirety can actually comply with the verification standards.
Happy to.
Yeah, go on.
Don't know if this is working. Yeah. I think I'd echo James's point. It's really complex, right? And we wouldn't be sat up here having multiple different views if it wasn't. I would probably put a plug for trade, which we haven't really talked about in terms of bilateral government-to-government, negotiations and trade requirements, because let's be honest, you leave it up to the market, and to your point, it takes ages. And also, every supply chain looks slightly different and has a slightly different set of issues and challenges and opportunities. Whereas I think if we could have, to Rodrigo's point, under a WTO standard, some kind of coherent framework that at least created some kind of guardrails, then you still need to create a bit of freedom within that framework, but at least you then have a kind of a consistent level playing field. At the moment, trade conversation sits separately to what we as businesses are trying to figure out or are being required to respond to legislation or regulation on. So I think we need to bring that together.
The only observation I make about that is if you try and tie it in with trade negotiations, the world will have fallen apart
100%.
by the time that you even get the first negotiation in place. So somehow bringing the two together is definitely right. I want to come to Sarah here, and then there's a gentleman here, and then we might have run out of time, but Sarah.
Thank you. Good morning, panel. Thank you very much. Sarah Webster from Britvic, also fresh off a plane from Brazil on Saturday. There's been an awful lot of talk here about limiting deforestation. I was meeting farmers last week who are also being impacted by the impact of large agriculture and pesticides, monocultures, and the impact that that has on biodiversity. So I would like to understand the panel's view on what's being done to minimize and support biodiversity in agriculture in Brazil. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We're going to come to this gentleman here, so if you can give him the mic next, please. Maybe not. Yeah, thank you. But if you would just wait, sir. Who would like to take Sarah's question first? Rodrigo?
I might. I may. Thanks for your question, and I think it's extremely important because it looks like deforestation is the only subject we need to try to address, and it goes much beyond than this. I'm heading to COP15 in Montreal, where the global biodiversity framework is supposed to be agreed. And it relates to sustainable use of biodiversity as long as conservation and genetic resources. And there's plenty of different indicators to try to say that this is sustainable or not. When it comes to large-scale agriculture in Brazil, and I think everywhere, every country that does large-scale agriculture and relies on pesticide use and relies on inputs use, it is related, this is intrinsic with the business. You cannot do large-scale monocultures of agroforestry systems for soybean together with banana or some. You can at small scale. So there are different types of agricultural systems. And we have plenty of models in Brazil. And in my view, what we need to do is Alexandre brought the use of nitrogen fixation in soybean and other crops in Brazil, which in the past 10 years gave us the ability to enhance productivity and reduce emissions due to the need to not to use fertilizers, for example, together with the no-till, and in Egypt there's a lot of talking about regenerative. What does this mean, regenerative? Of course, if we are talking on a very small scale, it's one thing. But for every system, if we don't take care of soil health, and soil fertility, there's no sense of trying to produce any food because you will not be able to produce. So there's a lot of good stuff when we look at the low carbon agricultural plan in Brazil with the technologies, and that's the beauty of the Paris Agreement when parties brought their proposals to the table, and there's 141 NDCs brought by the parties trying to address agriculture. How they will address agriculture, it will rely on several things, and one common thing for me is innovation. Because without innovation and technology, no country can enhance, produce, and tackle climate change as a common challenge. So there's plenty of things going on in terms of technology and innovation, and I believe any agricultural system must adopt good practices and technologies to be able to deliver more sustainable production.
Very quickly, to complement, Brazil gratefully is big enough to have a space for large agriculture, organics, conventional agriculture. Use lots of defensives for the agriculture, but in terms of per hectare, if you look at the volumes Brazil uses to control insects, diseases, is less than many countries around the world, even here in Europe. Brazil, I think, is in the 5th place in terms of volume of insects per hectare. The total volume is bigger because you have a large area. We have 30% of the biodiversity of the planet. Everybody is looking at us. For example, with this revolution in genetics, and I work with genetics, the cassava, the cacao, the peanuts that have the origin in Brazil areas were already sequenced the whole genome. That's the biggest information for use techniques like genome edition, even transgenics. But unfortunately, we don't have many scientists of Brazil working in this work. Thus, yes, biodiversity is key for us as well. We must preserve. Not only, I showed that picture about the Amazon forest. We must preserve because the source of water, rain, for the central and south comes from there. But on the other hand, this big biodiversity that we have, it's the source for the future of strategies of solving problems in medicine, in health, human health, in agriculture, where you look how evolution did many of the species we have and bring these ideas, those genes, those metabolites, and use for the future. So all the planet is looking at our biodiversity to get that, and I hope we can get that together.
Thank you. Last question, I'm afraid. Sorry, sir. Well, if you're very brief, we can get this gentleman in.
Yeah, Carlos Pellicer. I'm a global board member of UPL, and I'm very engaged in different initiatives related to the climate change. One of them is Zero Summit. We just recognized Nepomuceno and his team in Brazil for the Zero Award because of this soybean, low carbon soybean. It's amazing. Congratulations for that. I'm involved in the Climate Victory, a fund that we are work for startups related to the climate change perspective. And my point here is that I completely agree with Rodrigo that technology is the way that we need to progress. And I believe today we have a lot of technology to trace and to understand what is happening there. I believe we need to fund some areas that is very important in Brazil, like IBAMA. Say, in Brazil, before 2008, is one acceptance related to deforestation. After 2008, is another game. And when you go to IBAMA, IBAMA can give you a clear analysis if you are a criminal or not. If you are a criminal that you have cut the forest after 2008, is a huge problem. Say, Rodrigo, why we don't use
Could you come
that?
to the question, please?
Yeah, why you don't use that to really enforce who buys the products from the farmers to say you are legal or you are illegal, because that can demonstrate that.
I'm going to take your question now, so if you want to take my mic and just ask your question.
Okay, thank you very much. Adriel from Shimejito Urban Farms. About food productions and global emissions, we know that transport, packaging, and stocks are responsible for most part of carbon emissions. UK produced 54% of their food, according to your reports last year. What do you think the current industry stakeholders should do to bring more players in local urban farming production and go beyond animal protein and commodity exports?
Thank you. Admirably brief. Rodrigo, do you want to answer the first question?
Law enforcement. We are struggling with the car validation. Why? Because the states that are entrusted and responsible for the car validation doesn't have teams and people, people and computers, and the system is there. It was created by the Forest Environmental Service. So why Mato Grosso and São Paulo and Espírito Santo states are advancing? Because there's political will to do that. And now I tend to believe that it's becoming clear for the states governments, if they don't do that, sectors and companies and stakeholders will suffer, because we have the regulations, we are starting to enforce, but we are lagging behind from what we should be right now in 2022. So I agree that we have the regulations, and enforcement is the key word in my mind.
And who would like to take that gentleman's question? Anybody want to take?
Hello, can you hear me? Command and control. That's what's lacking. We have a strong legal framework. The bad actors are clearly there. It lacks command and control. This is what we expect in this next government that's coming. We had this experience in the past where significant reduction in deforestation has taken place, and now we're optimistic on that we'll have an enforcement. IBAMA essentially is the police arm of the Ministry of Environment. And then when you deflate, when you reduce the resources allocated to IBAMA, it's open game for environmental crime. So hopefully this scenario will be changing.
Anyone else want to come in on any of that? Or I'm gonna get you an answer to your question, sir, but not now. We're running out of time. I think it's time for you to say thank you to the panel for their contribution. My thanks to them all for an extraordinary amount of information and detail, which will be available to you afterwards. It's time for coffee now, and Hugo will tell us what time we have to be back, but I would think it's about 12 minutes from now. Thank you very much.